Welcome to our channel, where the stories of people from different eras and professions come to life. We are in magnificent Ephesus, right by the sea, where the great temple of Artemis reaches toward the heavens, and ships from all over the world fill the harbor. Subscribe, and after listening, be sure to share your impressions in the comments.
December slipped into Millford, Massachusetts, like a silent thief. Only yesterday, autumn still clutched the town with its stubborn gray fingers of rain. Today, a light, dry snow crunched beneath boots. The outskirts stirred slowly, unwillingly, breathing thin smoke from chimneys into the cold air. That smoke, faint and barely visible, told the same story everywhere. Stoves were lit, but people were saving every stick of wood, waiting for the true frosts. They would come. Elias Thorne, the stove maker and chimney sweep, knew it better than anyone. He felt the change in the wind, saw the sky grow heavy and low like a stone lid. The winter of 1852 would be cruel. He felt its breath on his skin in the cold that cut through his thick wool coat and tightened the muscles along his spine. His workshop stood in a narrow alley among other craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, glaziers. The houses were low, their shingled roofs steep, their windows small to keep warmth inside. In winter, these streets became a burrow, dark, cramped, but safe. No gentlemen in tall hats walked here, no carriages rattled past. This was the quiet world of working people. Elias opened the door. The smell of old soot, clay and iron met him at once. The smell of honest work. He loved it. In the corner beneath a canvas lay his tools: picks, scoops, brushes, iron rods. Jars of mortar and sacks of clay stood ready on the shelves. Everything was in its place. Winter was the season when people finally remembered their stoves. In summer, a stove was nothing but a black hole in the wall. In winter, it became the beating heart of a home. If that heart stopped, the house itself would die. He hung up his coat, tied on his leather apron, and reached for his tools. Today, he had to finish patching a cracked seam in the baker's stove down the street. The job was simple, yet it required patience. Elias never rushed. Haste ruined good work. His late wife used to say, "You move slower than a snail, but your stoves last forever." 4 years had passed since consumption took her. Still, sometimes he caught himself listening for her voice at the door. He shook his head, pushing the memory away. Work was the only cure for such thoughts. Work left no room for self-pity. He mixed fresh clay in the wooden trough, working it with steady hands until it was soft enough to spread, yet firm enough to hold. Outside the small window, the snow grew thicker, large flakes drifting down to cover the town in white silence. Elias finished mixing the clay, scooped a smaller portion, and stepped out into the street. The walk to the baker's place was only 3 blocks, but the snow was already deep enough that his boots sank with every step. He moved carefully. Falling with tools in hand could mean a broken arm and no income through the worst part of winter. The baker greeted him like an old friend. For the baker, a working stove meant bread, and bread meant survival. Elias nodded, went straight to the kitchen and examined the old red brick stove. A thin but deep crack ran along the upper seam. If left unrepaired, it would widen by Christmas and ruin the entire structure. The repair took nearly 2 hours. Elias sealed the crack, smoothed the joint, and tested the draft. Everything was in order. The baker paid him in small coins and 2 warm loaves of fresh bread. The bread was still hot and smelled so good it made his mouth water. Money was money, but warm bread in winter felt like a small piece of happiness. On the way back, the snow fell even heavier. The town sank into white silence. Footsteps sounded muffled, voices distant. Elias loved such days. Winter was not his enemy, but an ally. It made people value heat, value fire, and he was the man who brought that fire into their homes. Back in his workshop, he kindled his own small stove, the perfect one he had built 5 years earlier while his wife was still alive. She used to sit on the bench watching him choose bricks and shape the flue. "You're a wizard, not a stove maker," she would say. He would laugh. "No magic, just knowledge. How air moves, how heat spreads, how smoke escapes." The stove crackled. Flames danced behind the cast iron door. Warmth slowly filled the room. Elias sat on the bench, broke one loaf and ate slowly, staring into the fire through the narrow slits. Fire was alive. It fascinated him. Outside came the crunch of footsteps. Someone stopped at the door and knocked. Elias opened it. On the threshold stood his young apprentice, Thomas, red-faced from the cold, his cap dusted with snow. "Master, I'm here. There's work," Thomas said in his clear young voice. Elias nodded and let him inside. "Warm up first. Tomorrow we clean chimneys at Widow Hawthorne's place. She sent for us 3 times already." Thomas smiled and shook snow from his cap. "That old lady is always afraid the chimney will clog and the house will burn down." Elias chuckled. "She's right to be afraid. I've seen houses burn because chimneys were neglected. Fire doesn't care if you're rich or poor." Thomas sat near the stove, stretching his hands toward the warmth. Youth still burned brightly in him. Everything interested him. Everything was new. He learned the trade with hunger, asking questions, remembering everything. Elias saw his younger self in the boy, energetic, certain the world was fair. Life had not yet worn those edges smooth. "Master," Thomas asked with excitement, "is it true that the fireplace at Hawthorne Manor has golden tiles?" Elias snorted. "Not golden, old Dutch tiles with beautiful paintings. The house is from the last century. General Hawthorne lived there. Now it's just his widow. The fireplaces there are indeed fine, nothing like the simple ones we usually see." Thomas gazed dreamily into the flames. "I'd love to see something like that someday. All my life I've only worked on plain stoves." Elias shrugged. "You will. There are plenty of orders in winter. Maybe they'll call us again. Old houses always need repairs." They fell silent. Outside, twilight thickened and snow kept falling, covering the town. Elias took out a bottle of cheap wine and 2 mugs. "A drink for winter and for honest work." Thomas nodded. The sour wine warmed them. "For work," they said together. They sat by the fire for a while longer. Work and warmth. That was what kept a man going. The rich in their grand houses might believe happiness lay in money, fine clothes and balls, but real happiness was simpler. A warm stove, fresh bread, hands that could create something useful. Thomas left half an hour later. Elias remained alone. He sat staring into the flames, thinking about the coming winter, the many repairs ahead, and how stoves he built would outlive him. That felt right. A man passes, but his work remains. Snow kept falling outside. Elias added wood to the stove, closed the damper, lay down on his narrow bed under a heavy blanket, and slowly drifted into sleep. In half dreams, he saw hundreds of stoves he had built over the years. All of them breathed, all of them lived. He was their creator, their father. They held the warmth he had given them. The first heavy snow continued to blanket the outskirts of Millford in a quiet, white shroud. Winter had arrived. The season of stoves had begun. Frosts grew stronger. Mid-December turned so bitter that even the old-timers could not remember anything like it. The local river began to freeze, a rare sight. People wrapped themselves in wool, kept stoves burning day and night, and wood grew more expensive each day. The poor burnt whatever they could: old furniture, scraps, even books. Elias worked from dawn till dusk, moving from house to house. His hands ached from cold and soot. His back hurt from crawling through attics and onto roofs. But there was no one to complain to, and no point anyway. Winter was winter. That day, when the summons from Hawthorne Manor arrived, Elias had just finished cleaning a chimney for the cobbler. The cobbler paid in copper coins, grumbled about life, and offered to mend Elias's boots at half price. Elias agreed. The soles were worn through. He stepped outside, thrust his hands into his pockets, and headed toward his workshop. Snow crunched underfoot. The sky was pale and low. Waiting at the gate of the workshop stood a tall, lean man in black with gray side whiskers. He was dressed well, but in an old-fashioned style. High collar, a cane in his hand, and a wide-brimmed hat. Elias recognized him immediately as a gentleman's servant.
"Are you Master Thorne?" the man asked in an even, emotionless voice. Elias nodded. "My name is Francis. I serve as butler to Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne. You are urgently needed at the manor. There is a problem with the main fireplace." Elias pulled his hands from his pockets and looked at the old servant more carefully. Francis stood straight despite his years. His face was impassive, the face of someone who had seen much in life. "What kind of problem?" Francis paused, choosing his words. "The fireplace makes strange noises, a howling, a moaning sound. It started recently, and Mrs. Hawthorne is quite distressed." Elias shrugged. "It happens. Draft issues or a loose damper. I'll take a look. When should I come?" "Now, if possible. The carriage is waiting around the corner." Elias was surprised. A carriage for a simple stove maker? He hid it well, nodded, went inside for his tools and lantern. Thomas was out on another job. He would manage alone. A fireplace was usually straightforward.
The carriage was indeed waiting, old but well kept. The driver, bundled in a thick coat, dozed on the box. Francis tapped with his cane. The driver woke. Elias climbed in. Francis sat opposite. The carriage moved off. They rode for about 20 minutes, first through town, then beyond, where the old estate stood. The houses here were different, tall, with columns and iron fences. Gardens and snow-covered alleys spoke of wealth. Elias looked out the window in silence. Francis remained silent too. An invisible line lay between them, the line between masters and working men. Francis served the gentry, but came from simple folk like Elias. Yet one served, and the other was free. That made all the difference. Hawthorne Manor was a massive building in the style of the previous century. The facade was decorated with plaster rosettes. Windows were tall with heavy shutters. Smoke rose thinly from the chimneys. Elias immediately noticed the weak draught.
Francis led him through the grand entrance. The hallway was enormous, with marble floors, gilded mirrors, and portraits on the walls. The splendor looked tired, like an aging actress living out her days in forgotten glory. Elias wiped his boots carefully and removed his cap. Francis led him further along the corridor, past closed doors and rooms where dust lay thick on the furniture. The house was far too large for the few people who still lived in it. Elias could feel the emptiness seeping from the walls. Once balls had echoed here, guests had laughed, servants had hurried with trays.
Now only silence remained. Francis stopped at the door, knocked softly. "Mrs. Hawthorne, the master has arrived." A quiet but clear voice answered from inside. "Come in." They entered. The room was a large drawing room with high ceilings and heavy curtains. In the center stood an old tiled fireplace with beautiful blue paintings. Thomas had been right. It was magnificent.
The tiles were antique, the work of craftsmen from a past century. Such things were no longer made. Before the fireplace, in an armchair, sat a grey-haired woman in a dark dress, her back straight. Her face was noble but weary, her eyes attentive. "You are the stove master?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Francis had told her of the problem. The fireplace howled. Not just any howl, a horrible sound like a moan or a wail. It did not happen always, only when... She paused, as if reluctant to continue. Francis cleared his throat. "Only when Mr. Charles arrives, the nephew of the late general." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Only then?" "Only then," Francis confirmed. "We checked. When Mr. Charles enters the house, within minutes the fireplace begins to howl. When he leaves, it stops." Elias scratched the back of his head. Strange, but nothing supernatural. Fireplaces were capricious things. They reacted to temperature changes, to moving air. Perhaps the nephew always entered in a way that created a draft or slammed a door just so. "I can examine it," he said. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded. Elias approached, crouched, and looked inside with his lantern. The fireplace was cold. The flue rose upward into darkness. The walls were fairly clean, with only a little soot. The damper seemed intact. He moved it. It worked normally, nothing obviously wrong. "When will the nephew visit next?" he asked. Mrs. Hawthorne and Francis exchanged glances. "This evening," she said. There was fatigue, perhaps fear, in her voice. Elias stood and brushed off his knees. "Then I will wait. I need to hear the sound myself to understand where it comes from." Mrs. Hawthorne asked Francis to take the master to the kitchen and feed him. Elias followed the butler down a narrow staircase. The kitchen was warm and smelled of soup and fresh bread. A plump woman of about 50 in an apron bustled at the stove. Seeing Elias, she threw up her hands. "Oh, master, you're here because of that dreadful howling? I tell you, it's unclean. The general spirit won't leave us in peace." Elias smiled. "Spirits don't live in chimneys, ma'am. Only soot, and sometimes birds." The cook, Martha, shook her head. "You don't know, master. I've served here 20 years. The general was strict but honest. His nephew, Charles, thinks only of grabbing the fortune. He keeps telling Mrs. Hawthorne to sell the house, move to a small apartment in town, while he pockets the money and gambles it away." Francis gave Martha a stern look, but she continued. "What's true is true. The general, God rest his soul, sees from the other side how his nephew torments his aunt. That's why the fireplace howls. It drives the scoundrel away." Elias sat at the table and accepted a bowl of thick meat soup. He ate slowly, listening. Martha kept talking. Francis stayed silent, but his face showed he also believed in the ghost. Elias did not. He knew every miracle had a simple, earthly cause. In the evening, as dusk fell, a knock sounded at the door. Francis went to open it. Elias, waiting in a small room next to the drawing room, tensed. Voices approached, one young and lively, the other quiet and old. Then footsteps. The drawing room door flew open wide. "Aunt Eleanor, good evening!" The voice was cheerful but false. Elias peered through a crack. A young man of about 27 entered, dressed fashionably, a stylish coat, top hat, a cane with a silver knob. His face was well groomed, moustache neat, but his eyes darted restlessly. Elias had seen such men before, gamblers living on credit.
Mrs. Hawthorne rose and extended her hand. Charles kissed it and sat opposite her. They spoke quietly. Elias listened with half an ear while watching the fireplace. A minute or two passed. Then a low, drawn-out, horrible sound began, as if someone were moaning inside the flue.
The howl grew louder, then faded, then rose again. Charles turned pale and jumped to his feet. "Again, Aunt, this is unbearable!" Mrs. Hawthorne remained seated, only clenching her hands in her lap. "I invited the master. He is here to find out what is wrong." Charles turned and saw Elias stepping out of the side room. "You heard it? What is this? Where does that sound come from?" Elias approached the fireplace and listened. The howling continued. He placed his hand on the tiles and felt the vibration. Interesting. The sound came from inside the flue. The damper or something else. He would need to examine the chimney from the roof outside. "It's dark now," he said. "I'll do it tomorrow." Charles paced nervously. "Do you think it can be fixed?" Elias shrugged. "I'll look." The howling gradually died away. Charles said goodbye to his aunt hurriedly, as if afraid the sound would return, and hurried out, slamming the door behind him. Elias watched him go. An interesting detail. Charles always entered and left by throwing the door wide open. A draft. Cold air rushed in from the street through the hallway into the drawing room. The fireplace reacted. But why a howl specifically? Mrs. Hawthorne looked at Elias with hope. "Can you fix this?" He nodded. "I'll try. Tomorrow I'll come with my apprentice and inspect the roof." She sighed with relief. Francis saw Elias to the door and paid him a deposit. Elias stepped out into the freezing night. The cold hit his face and took his breath away. He walked along the snow-covered road, thinking. The fireplace howled only when Charles came because Charles slammed the door. This created a strong airflow. But what exactly in the flue made that sound? He would need to climb to the roof and check. On the way home, the thought kept returning. If he repaired the fireplace, the howling would stop. Charles would stop being afraid and would continue pressuring his aunt to sell the house. Then what? It was not his business. His job was to repair stoves, not interfere in family matters. Yet the thought would not leave him. He returned to the workshop late. Thomas was already asleep on the bench. Elias kindled the stove, sat down, and stared into the fire. Life was a strange thing. Sometimes a small accident decided more than any will. A loose damper in a flue became a ghost, protecting an old woman from her greedy nephew. Repair it or not? The question was simple. The answer was difficult. Elias lay down but could not sleep for a long time. Outside, the real wind howled, not the fireplace. And that howl reminded him of the sound he had heard today, of how sometimes secrets were more useful than truth. Morning greeted Elias with the same frost. Late December was unusually severe. Breath turned to white clouds. Fingers froze even in gloves. Elias rose before dawn, kindled the stove, and brewed thick coffee with chicory. The coffee warmed him from inside and chased away sleepiness. Thomas arrived at dawn, yawning and rubbing his red ears. "Today to the Hawthornes?" he asked hopefully. Elias nodded, gathering tools. "We need to climb to the roof and examine the chimney." Thomas brightened. For him, a visit to a grand house was an adventure. Elias understood and smiled to himself. Youth saw the world brighter than it was. Youth believed something extraordinary waited around every corner. With the years, one learned that the extraordinary was rare. Mostly ordinary work, ordinary people, ordinary troubles. They walked on foot,
No carriage was sent this time. The road took over an hour. Thomas chattered non-stop. Elias stayed silent, thinking. A howling fireplace, a frightened nephew, a lonely old woman. A simple story, yet so many layers. Greed, fear, loneliness, eternal human things. The manor met them with silence. Francis opened the door, greeted them politely, and led them to the kitchen. Martha was already busy at the stove preparing breakfast for Mrs. Hawthorne.
Seeing Elias, she clapped her hands. "Ah, master, have you found where the howling comes from?" Elias shook his head. "Not yet. Today I'll climb to the roof and look at the chimney from outside." Martha poured them hot tea and served cabbage pie. The pie was fresh and tasty. Thomas ate with appetite, Elias more slowly. Martha sat nearby and could not resist talking. "Mr. Charles came again yesterday. The fireplace howled and he turned white as a sheet and left immediately, without even staying for supper. See how the ghost works? The general won't let him rest." Elias remained silent. Thomas asked, "What was the general like?" Martha sighed. "Strict, honest. He served the country faithfully, was wounded in the war, retired already ill. He died 3 years ago. Mrs. Hawthorne never recovered. They lived together 30 years. No children. Now she is alone, and the nephew only waits for her to die so he can take the inheritance." Francis, standing by the door, coughed.
"Martha, we should not discuss family matters with outsiders." Martha pressed her lips, but fell silent. Elias finished his tea and stood. "Time for the roof. Where is the ladder?" Francis led them through the house to a narrow staircase leading to the attic. The attic was huge, cold and dusty. Beams darkened under the roof. Cobwebs hung between them. It smelled of old wood and mold. Elias found the hatch to the roof, opened it. Frosty air rushed in, stinging his face. They climbed out. The roof was covered with shingles, slippery with ice. Wind whistled, cutting to the bone. Thomas barely kept his balance. Elias walked confidently. Roofs were his second workplace. He knew where to step, how to distribute weight. One mistake and you fell. A roof did not forgive. They reached the chimney. It was old brick with cracks in the mortar. Elias crouched and examined it. From outside, everything looked all right, but he shone his lantern down inside. Light was poor, yet he could see enough. The damper. It hung on hinges, and one hinge was clearly loose. The damper rattled and did not fit tightly against the flue wall. "Thomas, hold me." Thomas grabbed his belt. Elias leaned lower, reached inside, and touched the damper. It really wobbled. With a certain airflow, it would begin to vibrate and create the sound. There was the answer. Elias straightened and brushed soot from his hands. "Found it. The damper has come loose. When air passes in a certain way, it vibrates and howls." Thomas looked disappointed. "So, no ghost after all?" Elias smiled. "None. Just physics. And it happens only when Charles comes, because he throws the door wide open. A strong, cold draft rushes through. The fireplace pulls it in. The damper shakes. That's the howl." Thomas thought for a moment. "So we just need to secure the damper?" Elias nodded slowly. "Yes, secure it." They climbed down from the roof and returned to the kitchen. Martha immediately bombarded them with questions.
Elias answered evasively.
"The problem is in the chimney. I need materials to repair it properly. I'll bring them in a few days." Martha nodded, reassured. Francis saw them to the exit. Elias paused at the drawing room door and looked inside. Mrs. Hawthorne sat in her armchair by the window, gazing at the snow-covered garden. Her profile was noble, yet so tired. Loneliness wrapped around her like cold fog. Elias had seen such people before. They lived in the past because they had no future. On the way back, Thomas chattered. "Interesting, Master. Is Charles really so bad? Maybe he just wants to help his aunt, and the servants exaggerate." Elias shrugged. "I don't know. It's not my place to judge." Thomas was silent for a while, then asked, "When will we repair the fireplace?" "Soon." "And what if Charles really takes the inheritance and squanders it? Mrs. Hawthorne will be left with nothing." Elias stopped and looked at his apprentice. "Thomas, our job is to repair stoves, not to meddle in other people's family affairs." Thomas nodded, but Elias could see the boy disagreed. Youth believed in justice, believed one could fix everything, protect the weak, punish the wicked. With the years, that faith faded. The world was unjust, and your task was not to fix it, but simply to survive in it. They returned to the workshop by lunchtime. Elias let Thomas go and sat by the stove, staring into the fire. He thought, securing the damper would take an hour. The work was simple. But then what? Charles would stop being afraid and continue pressuring his aunt. She was already over 60 and in poor health. If she died, the entire manor would go to the nephew. He would sell it, waste the money, and no one could stop him. The law was on his side. Elias stood and paced the workshop. His wife used to say, "You take everything too seriously. Other people's problems are not your concern. Your concern is to build a stove that heats well and does not smoke. Everything else is not yours." She had been right. But why did he feel so uneasy now? That evening he went to the tavern. The craftsmen had gathered there, carpenters, cobblers, masons. They drank cheap wine and talked about life. Elias sat in the corner and ordered a mug. Next to him sat an old mason he had known for many years. "Heard you went to the Hawthornes?" the mason asked. "How is the old lady?" Elias shrugged. "Lives alone. The nephew is just waiting for her to die. They say he's deep in debt." "How do you know?" The mason grinned. "My brother repairs carriages in town. He saw this Charles, a dandy with no money, borrowing from usurers, promising to pay when he gets the inheritance." Elias drank his wine in silence. So it was true. Charles was waiting for the inheritance, and fear of the ghost held him back. For now. He returned home late. The workshop was dark and cold. He kindled the stove and sat down. His hands reached for the tools by themselves. He took a small hammer and began tapping slowly on an iron plate. The rhythmic sound calmed him and helped him think. What was more important, the duty of a master or the duty of a man? To repair the fault was right, but if that fault protected the weak from the strong, then what? His wife would probably have said, "Don't interfere, it's not your business." But his wife was no longer there, and he had to decide for himself. The next day, Francis came again. The old butler looked serious. "Mrs. Hawthorne wants to speak with you, master." Elias went. Francis led him to the drawing room. Mrs. Hawthorne sat in the same armchair, but looked even more tired. "Master, have you found the cause?" Elias nodded. "I have. The damper in the flue has loosened. It vibrates with the flow of air. That is the sound." Mrs. Hawthorne sighed. "So, no ghost?" "No." She was silent for a moment, then asked quietly, "Can you repair it?" Elias nodded slowly. "I can, but it will take time. I need materials that are not available now. I'll bring them in the spring." It was a lie. The materials were there. The work was simple, but he said it and did not regret it. Mrs. Hawthorne looked at him for a long time. Understanding flashed in her eyes. She understood he had lied, and why. "Thank you, master. Come in the spring." She paid him more than required. Elias took the money, bowed, and left. Francis saw him out in silence. At the door, the old butler quietly said, "Thank you." Elias did not answer. He stepped into the street and walked along the snowy road. The decision had been made. The fireplace would remain unfixed. While Charles was afraid, Mrs. Hawthorne was safe. It might be wrong, but perhaps it was just. January brought even harsher frosts to Millford. Such cold had not been remembered even by the grandparents. Thermometers showed readings that froze people on the streets. Wood cost a fortune. The poor broke fences and burned old furniture. The rich heated day and night, but even their grand houses stayed cold. Old walls held heat poorly. Elias worked without rest. He was called to repair stoves cracked by frost, clean blocked chimneys, restore fallen masonry. His hands ached, his back throbbed, but he could not stop. Winter was his time, his bread. Thomas helped, learned, carried tools. The boy grew stronger and learned much. Elias saw a good master in him. Perhaps in a few years, Thomas would open his own business. He did not return to Hawthorne Manor. 3 weeks had passed since he promised Mrs. Hawthorne he would come in spring. Sometimes he thought about her, about Charles, about the loose damper. Then he drove the thoughts away. It was not his concern. He had made his choice. Let it be. But in early January, Francis came again. The old butler walked on foot in his old but warm coat, leaning on his cane. His face was serious. "Master, Mrs. Hawthorne asks you to come urgently." Elias tensed. "What happened?" "The fireplace howls again, but stronger now, and the house is growing cold. We fear the chimney may collapse completely." Elias sighed. The damper must have loosened further, perhaps from the frost. He nodded, gathered his tools, and took Thomas with him. Work on the roof in such cold was dangerous. He needed backup. They rode in a hired sleigh. The driver huddled in his heavy coat, grumbling at the frost. The horse moved slowly on the icy road. Thomas was silent, looking out the window. Elias too stayed quiet, thinking about climbing the slippery roof in this weather. One wrong move and he would fall. But work was work. The manor met them with silence. Windows were curtained. Almost no smoke rose from the chimneys. Francis opened the door and led them inside. The house was noticeably colder than last time. Breath turned to steam. "Mrs. Hawthorne has caught a cold," Francis said quietly. "She is in bed. The doctor ordered the rooms kept warm, but we no longer light the drawing room fireplace. We are afraid the chimney will collapse." Elias went to the drawing room. The fireplace was cold and dead. He looked inside with his lantern. There was more soot. The draft was clearly broken. He would have to go up to the roof again. "Francis, bring strong ropes and a longer ladder." Francis nodded and left. Martha brought them hot tea with honey. Elias drank it. The tea warmed him, but not for long. Thomas drank slowly, delaying the moment they would have to go out into the frost. They climbed to the attic. The cold here was even worse. Wind whistled through cracks and moved between the beams. Elias opened the hatch and looked out. The wind struck his face, burning and taking his breath. The sky was gray and low. Snow lay thick on the roof, with ice beneath. "Thomas, tie the rope securely to the beam." Thomas tied it to a thick beam and checked the knot. Elias wrapped the other end around his waist and tightened it. If he slipped, the rope would hold him, if Thomas held. They climbed onto the roof. Frost gripped the body, penetrating every layer of clothing. Fingers went numb instantly. Elias moved slowly, testing every step. Thomas followed, holding the rope. The roof was slippery as glass. Thomas slipped once and nearly fell. Elias caught him. "Careful, boy. If you fall, I won't be able to pull you up." Thomas nodded, pale. Fear sobered him. They reached the chimney. Elias looked inside. What he saw did not please him. The damper hung on one hinge. The second had torn off completely. It rattled, catching on the flue walls and partially blocking the passage. The draft was broken. If not repaired, smoke would pour into the house. In such frost, that was deadly. People could die from carbon monoxide quietly, unnoticed. "Thomas, hand me the tools. Hammer, iron brackets, wire." Thomas passed everything. Elias removed his gloves, impossible to work in them. His hands froze instantly. He took the hammer and tried to drive a bracket into the brick. The hammer slipped. The blow was weak. Elias cursed through his teeth. Frost was the enemy of any work. He breathed on his fingers, rubbed them, and tried again. Slowly, little by little, he drove in the brackets, then wired the damper and secured it. The work took more than half an hour. His hands lost feeling, his face burnt from the cold. Thomas stood nearby, shivering but holding on. Finally, Elias finished. The damper was secure. The draft should be restored. He straightened and looked around. Millford lay below, snow-covered and frozen, quiet under the weight of the frosts. Smoke rose thinly from other chimneys. Life continued despite everything. People heated their stoves, cooked food, raised children, lived. Elias looked down at the street. A carriage had stopped. A young man in a fashionable coat and top hat stepped out. Charles. He strode quickly into the house, throwing the door wide open as always. Elias climbed down from the roof and returned to the attic. Thomas followed, moving stiffly from the cold. They went down to the kitchen. Martha immediately seated them by the stove and served hot soup. Elias ate slowly, feeling warmth spread through his body. His hands hurt and burned as they thawed from the frost. From the drawing room came Charles's loud, nervous voice. Then the sound, that same howl. The fireplace was howling again. Elias smiled faintly. He had secured the damper, but not completely. It now held firmly. The draft was restored, and smoke would not enter the house. But with a strong airflow, it would still vibrate, weaker, quieter, but it would. Charles burst out of the drawing room, pale and frightened. Seeing Elias, he rushed toward him. "You repaired it? Why is the fireplace still howling?" Elias slowly raised his head and looked at the nephew. "I repaired it as much as I could. The damper is old and barely holds. To fix it completely, we would need to dismantle the entire flue from top to bottom. That is work for several weeks and very expensive." Charles grew even paler. "And until then, it will keep howling?" Elias shrugged. "Perhaps. If the airflow is strong, try closing the door quietly, without slamming. Then the howling will be weaker." Charles stood bewildered, then turned sharply and left the house. Elias watched him go. Fear was stronger than greed. For now. Frances led Elias to Mrs. Hawthorne. She lay in bed, covered with a heavy blanket. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but she smiled when she saw the master. "You repaired it?" Elias nodded. "The draft is restored. You can light fires. Smoke will not enter the rooms." "And the howling?" Elias paused. "The howling will remain for a while, until spring comes."
She closed her eyes and sighed with relief. "Thank you." Elias left the room. Francis paid him, adding extra. Elias did not refuse.
The work had been hard and honestly earned. He and Thomas stepped out into the street. The frost still held the town firmly, but Elias walked confidently. The work was done. Mrs. Hawthorne would not freeze. The fireplace would warm the house, but continue to frighten Charles. It might be wrong, but perhaps it was just. On the way back, Thomas was silent for a long time, then suddenly asked, "Master, did you deliberately not repair it completely?" Elias looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The damper. You could have secured it so the howling stopped entirely, but you didn't." Elias walked on in silence, then said, "Thomas, sometimes in life there are situations where what is correct is not what is just. To repair the fireplace completely would be correct, but to leave it so it protects an old woman from her greedy nephew, that is just. Do you understand the difference?" Thomas thought. "I understand, but do we have the right to decide for others?" "We don't," Elias agreed. "But sometimes we must, because if not us, then who? The law? The law is on Charles's side. He is the heir. The church? The church would say, 'Be resigned.' Meanwhile, the old woman would be left without protection. And so one must choose, follow the rules or follow conscience." Thomas nodded, but Elias saw the boy was not fully convinced. Youth always wanted everything clear, right or wrong. With the years, one understood that between right and wrong lay a vast grey zone, and in that zone lived conscience. They returned to the workshop in the evening. Elias kindled the stove and sat staring into the fire. His hands still ached from the frost. He thought about Mrs. Hawthorne's tired face, her loneliness, about Charles, his fear, his debts. Life was a complicated thing. Nothing was ever simple. Outside, the frost grew stronger. Stars appeared in the sky, bright and cold. The town fell asleep under their merciless light, while Elias sat by the fire, knowing he had done right. Not according to the law, but according to conscience. And that was enough. Mid-January brought some relief. The frosts eased to 15 below. For the people of Millford, this felt almost like a thaw. Streets came alive. People left their houses. Merchants opened stalls. Life returned to its usual course. Elias worked without pause. Orders came one after another. Everyone wanted their stoves checked after the terrible cold to make sure the masonry had not cracked and chimneys were not blocked. He traveled around the town and outskirts, repairing, patching, giving advice. Thomas helped and grew more skillful. Elias saw the boy would become a good master. The main thing was not to lose his conscience. A craft without conscience was an empty thing. In those days, Elias often thought about his decision, about the fireplace at Hawthorne Manor, about the damper he had repaired only halfway, about Mrs. Hawthorne and Charles, about how he, a simple stove maker, had taken upon himself the right to decide another person's fate. Was it right? Did he have the right? In the evenings, sitting by his own stove, he reflected. His wife, had she been alive, would surely have said, "Don't meddle in other people's affairs. Your business is stoves, not the fate of the rich." She had been simple and practical. She saw the world clearly. There was work, there was money, there was bread on the table. Everything else was extra. But his wife was gone, and there was no one to tell him he was wrong and to leave it alone. One evening, the old mason came to his workshop, the same one with whom he had drunk wine in the tavern. The mason was tipsy, spoke loudly, and waved his arms. I heard! He shouted. Charles, the general's nephew, sold his carriage, sold it to pay debts. The usurers were pressing him hard, threatening prison. Elias listened in silence.
The mason continued. And they say he is now afraid to visit the manor, afraid of the ghost. Imagine, a grown man shaking like a rabbit. The old lady must be pleased. Let the nephew be afraid for a while. The mason left. Elias remained alone. He sat staring into the fire. Charles had sold his carriage. Things must be very bad. The debts were apparently huge, and on top of that, the fear of the ghost. Perhaps this would make him reconsider? Or would fear push him to a desperate act, to convince Mrs. Hawthorne to sell the house immediately while she was alive, or something worse? Elias stood and paced the workshop. Anxiety sat in his chest and would not leave. He had made a decision, but its consequences were impossible to predict. Life did not divide neatly into black and white. It was grey, unsteady, unpredictable.
The next day, Francis came again.
The old butler looked tired but calm. "Mrs. Hawthorne wants to see you, master." Elias was surprised. "Is something wrong with the fireplace?" "No, the fireplace is fine. She wants to talk." Elias went. Francis led him to the drawing room. Mrs. Hawthorne sat in her armchair, wrapped in a warm shawl. She was recovering, but still weak. Seeing Elias, she nodded and pointed to the chair opposite. "Sit down, master." Elias sat. Francis quietly left and closed the door. They were alone. Mrs. Hawthorne looked at him for a long time, attentively, then said softly, "I know what you did." Elias remained silent. "You repaired the fireplace so it would continue to frighten Charles. You did not fix the damper completely. I know." Elias met her gaze. There was no anger in her eyes, only weariness and gratitude. "You acted wrongly," she continued. "You deceived me."
You deceived Charles.
But she fell silent, then added quietly, "Yet perhaps you saved me." Elias did not know what to say. She went on, "Charles is my only relative. After my husband's death, he is the only one who visits me. But I am not blind. I see he waits for my death, waits for the inheritance. He is in debt. He desperately needs money, and I fear that if he stops being afraid—" She did not finish the sentence, but Elias understood. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I had no right." She raised her hand, stopping him. "You did. You did what you had to do, not as a master, but as a man, and I am grateful." Elias sat silent, words stuck in his throat. Mrs. Hawthorne sighed. "My husband was an honest man. He believed in law, order, justice. But he also said, 'Law is made by people, therefore it is imperfect. Sometimes justice requires breaking the law. You understood that and acted rightly." She stood, walked to the window, and looked at the snowy garden. "I am old. I have little time left. But while I live, I want to preserve this house. This house is the memory of my husband, of our life. If Charles sells it and destroys it, the memory will disappear, and I cannot allow that." Elias stood and approached her. "What do you want me to do?" She turned and looked at him. "Nothing. Simply leave everything as it is. Let the fireplace continue to howl. Let Charles continue to be afraid. Perhaps fear will teach him respect, or at least caution." Elias nodded. They stood in silence, looking out the window. Outside, light snow was falling, slow and unhurried. The world was quiet, white, calm. Returning to the workshop, Elias could not calm down for a long time. The conversation with Mrs. Hawthorne had turned something inside him. He had thought he was deceiving her. It turned out she had understood everything from the beginning. Moreover, she approved. So he had acted rightly. Thomas returned from another job and found the master sitting by the stove,
deep in thought.
Master, has something happened?
Elias shook his head. No, everything is fine. Thomas sat nearby, was silent for a while, then asked, "Do you never regret becoming a stove maker?" Elias looked at him in surprise. "Why should I regret it?" "Well, the work is hard, dirty, dangerous, and the pay is small. You could have done something else." Elias smiled. "What, for example? Trade? Or go into service in a gentleman's house? It would be warmer and better fed there." He shook his head. "Thomas, you don't understand. A craft is not just work, it is a calling. When you build a stove, you create warmth. You give people life. Without a stove in winter, one cannot survive, which means you are needed, you are important. Do you understand?" Thomas thought. "I understand, but the work is still hard." "Hard," Elias agreed, "but honest. I do what I know how to do. I do it well, and I know my stoves warm people and save them from cold."
That gives meaning, and meaning is more important than money.
Thomas nodded, but Elias saw the boy had not fully understood. Youth always wanted more money, more recognition, more comfort. With the years, one understood that what mattered was not how much you had, but what you did and for whom. That evening, Elias went to the tavern again. The same craftsmen had gathered, drinking wine and talking about life. Someone complained about customers, someone boasted of successful work. Elias listened and occasionally added a word. He felt himself part of this world, the world of simple people who worked with their hands, earned their bread, and lived by conscience. An old carpenter, a friend of many years, asked, "Heard you went to the Hawthornes?" "I did. How is the old lady?" "She lives, holds on, and the nephew is afraid of the ghost." Elias smiled. The carpenter laughed. "The ghost, what a fool. Though perhaps it's for the best. Let him be afraid.
Maybe he'll leave his aunt in peace." Elias stayed silent. The carpenter continued, "You know, I was thinking, we craftsmen work all our lives for the rich. We build their houses, repair their furniture, lay their stoves, and they look down on us. But when they need help, they come to us, because without us, they are nothing." Elias nodded. "That is true. The rich depend on the poor more than they think. Who builds their houses? Who heats their stoves? Who bakes their bread? Simple people. Without us, all that luxury, all those manors, would turn into cold, empty boxes." He returned home late, kindled the stove, sat down, and thought about life, about choices, about what was right and what was not. He had decided. He had done right. Not according to the law, but according to conscience. And conscience was the only judge that never erred. It was inside. It always knew the truth. And if conscience was calm, then everything was correct. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The town slept under its white blanket. Elias looked into the fire and knew tomorrow would be a new day, new work, new cares. But tonight, he could sleep peacefully because he had acted as conscience commanded, and that was enough. Late January brought changes. The frosts finally retreated. Temperatures rose to zero. Snow began to melt during the day and freeze at night. Streets turned into a mess of mud and ice. Walking became harder than on clean snow. People cursed the weather, but in their hearts rejoiced. Winter was retreating. Spring was coming soon. Elias continued working. There were fewer orders. The frosts had passed. People no longer feared so much for their stoves, but work still came. Someone wanted a chimney cleaned before spring. Someone wanted a cracked brick replaced. Elias traveled around town, repairing and giving advice. Thomas helped and grew more confident. The boy had learned much, but most importantly, he had learned to think. Not just follow orders, but understand why and for what purpose.
That was what distinguished a master from an apprentice. As for Mrs. Hawthorne and Charles, Elias heard nothing more. 3 weeks had passed since their last meeting. He thought everything was probably going its own way. Charles visited, the fireplace howled, Charles left, frightened. Mrs. Hawthorne lived quietly. The balance held. But one morning, while Elias was kindling the stove in the workshop, an unfamiliar man entered. Young, about 30, dressed modestly but neatly. Intelligent face, attentive eyes. "Are you Master Thorne?" Elias nodded. "Yes." "My name is Herman. I am a lawyer. I represent the interests of Mr. Charles Hawthorne." Elias tensed. "A lawyer? Why?" Herman entered the workshop, looked around, and sat on the bench. "Mr. Charles is concerned about the situation with the fireplace in his aunt's manor."
You repaired that fireplace?
"I did.
But the fireplace continues to make strange sounds.
It does." Herman took out papers and spread them on the table. "Mr. Charles believes you performed the work in bad faith. He demands you return the money and repair the fireplace again, free of charge." Elias slowly raised his head and looked at the lawyer. "I repaired the fireplace as best I could. The damper is old, the flue is old. To eliminate the sound completely, we need to replace the entire damper or even part of the chimney. That is expensive." Herman nodded. "I understand, but Mr. Charles insists. He is ready to file a complaint with the Craftsmen's Guild. That could damage your reputation." Elias sat silent. A complaint to the guild was serious. The guild could revoke his right to work or impose a fine. Charles had found a way to apply pressure. Since the ghost would not let him reach his aunt, he decided to remove the one who created that ghost. Elias stood and walked to the window.
He looked out at the street and thought.
Charles was no fool. He had realized something was wrong with the fireplace. Perhaps he had even guessed that Elias had deliberately not repaired it fully, and now he was trying to pressure him through the law. Elias turned back to the lawyer. "Tell Mr. Charles I will return to the manor and examine the fireplace once more. If I find an error in my work, I will correct it, free of charge. If there is no error, I will not return the money." Herman nodded, gathered his papers. "I will pass it on. When can you come?" "The day after tomorrow." The lawyer left. Elias sat on the bench and thought. Charles was attacking, trying to regain control of the situation. That meant fear was beginning to recede, or greed had become stronger than fear. Thomas returned from the street and found the master deep in thought. "What happened?" Elias told him. Thomas frowned. "What will you do?" "I'll go and look. And if he really files a complaint?" Elias shrugged.
Let him. I did nothing wrong. I repaired the fireplace as I know how.
Thomas sat beside him. "Master, maybe you should repair it completely so the howling stops?" Elias looked at him. "And then what? Charles will leave you in peace and not file the complaint? But have you thought about Mrs. Hawthorne?" Thomas fell silent. Elias continued. "Charles will stop being afraid. He will come to his aunt again and begin pressuring her. He may even get his way, sell the house and leave the old woman with nothing. Is that what you want?" Thomas shook his head. "No, but I also don't want you to be punished." Elias smiled. "They won't punish me. I did the work honestly. If the guild wants to check, let them. They will find that the fireplace works. Smoke does not enter the house. There is draft. And if the damper vibrates, well, it is old. Not my fault." Thomas nodded, but anxiety remained on his face. Elias understood the boy was worried. Youth was always afraid of injustice.
Afraid that truth would not win. With the years, one understood that truth did not always win, but that did not mean one should stop fighting for it.
2 days later, Elias went to the manor, taking Thomas with him. Francis met them in silence and led them to the drawing room. Mrs. Hawthorne and Charles were sitting there. The nephew looked tense and nervous. Mrs. Hawthorne looked tired but calm. "Master," Charles began, "you repaired the fireplace a month ago, but it continues to howl. I demand an explanation." Elias nodded. "I examined the fireplace. The damper had loosened. I secured it as much as I could. The draft is restored. Smoke does not enter the house. The fireplace works normally, but it howls. It howls because the damper is old. It vibrates with a strong airflow. To eliminate this completely, we need to replace the damper or even part of the flue. That is expensive." Charles jumped up. "Why didn't you say so immediately? Why did you take the money but not finish the work?" Elias looked at him calmly. "I did the work as agreed. I repaired the damper and restored the draft. If you want more, pay more." Charles flushed red. "You are a swindler." Mrs. Hawthorne intervened. "Charles, calm down. The master did what he could. The fireplace heats. Smoke does not enter the rooms. I am satisfied." Charles turned to her. "Aunt, but this is unbearable. How can you live in such a house?" Mrs. Hawthorne smiled faintly. "I am used to it. It is the voice of your uncle. It reminds me of him." Charles stood bewildered, not knowing what to say. Elias used the moment. "If you wish, I can return in spring. When it is warmer, it will be easier to work on the roof. I will replace the damper completely." Charles nodded, still bewildered. "Good. In spring, but without extra payment." Elias shrugged. "We'll see." Charles left first, slamming the door. The fireplace howled long and plaintively. Elias smiled. Mrs. Hawthorne saw her nephew off with her eyes, then turned to Elias. "Thank you, master." Elias nodded. Francis saw them to the exit and paid for the visit. At parting, the old butler said quietly, "He hired a lawyer. He wants to pressure you." "I know. Be careful." Elias nodded and stepped into the street. Thomas walked beside him in silence. Then he asked, "Master, will you really return in spring?" "Maybe." "And repair it completely?" Elias stopped and looked at the sky. It was grey and low, but no longer so cold. Spring was near. "I don't know, Thomas. We'll see what happens in spring. Perhaps by then, Charles will come to his senses or find another way. Life is unpredictable." They walked along the muddy streets, and Elias thought, Charles was not giving up. He was looking for a way to regain control. But Mrs. Hawthorne was holding on. She understood the game and accepted it. The balance still held.
But for how long?
That evening, Elias sat by his stove again, staring into the flames and thinking about life, about struggles that were not always open or honest. Sometimes one had to maneuver, dodge, look for roundabout ways. The main thing was not to lose one's conscience, not to cross the line beyond which lay baseness. He had made his choice, protected the weak from the strong. It might not be right, but his conscience was silent, which meant he could live on. February was drawing to a close. The snow had almost melted. Only dirty drifts remained in shady corners and on northern slopes. The sun warmed more strongly. Days grew longer. The air smelled of spring, damp earth, awakening trees, hope. The town came alive after its winter sleep. Elias worked less. There were almost no orders for stoves. Spring was not the season for stove makers. People opened windows, rejoiced in the warmth, and forgot about fireplaces and chimneys until next autumn. Elias used this lull to put his workshop in order, repair tools, and teach Thomas the finer points of the craft. The boy could now clean chimneys and patch small cracks on his own. He was still far from a true master, but he knew the basics. Elias saw in him a continuer of the trade. When he grew old and could no longer climb roofs, Thomas would take his place. That was how it had always been. A master taught an apprentice. The apprentice became a master and taught a new one. The chain did not break. Elias had heard nothing of Mrs. Hawthorne and Charles for more than a month. He thought everything had probably calmed down. Charles had reconciled himself to the fireplace. Mrs. Hawthorne lived quietly. The balance was preserved. But at the end of February, an unexpected guest came to the workshop. Charles Hawthorne himself, without a lawyer, without servants, alone. He was dressed simply, not as elegantly as before. His face was tired and drawn. Elias met him warily. "Mr.
Charles." Charles nodded and removed his hat.
Master, may I speak with you?" Elias nodded and pointed to the bench. Charles sat down, was silent for a moment, then began. "I came to apologize for the lawyer, for the threats. I was wrong." Elias was surprised. He had not expected such words. "What happened?" Charles sighed. "Everything. Debts, creditors. They demanded payment and threatened prison. I thought the only way out was to force my aunt to sell the manor." He paused, then continued. "But then I realized that if she sold the house, she would die. Not immediately, but she would. This house is her life." Elias remained silent. Charles went on. "I visited her 2 weeks ago. I was going to persuade her again, but the fireplace howled and I became truly afraid. Not of the ghost, of myself, of what I was doing, of who I was becoming." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. "I remembered my uncle, the general. He was strict and honest.
He served the country and lived with honor. And I gambled, fell into debt, tried to rob my own aunt. Shame."
Elias stood beside him. "What have you decided to do?" Charles turned. "I found work as a simple clerk in a trading company. The pay is small but honest. I will repay the debts gradually, over years, but I will repay them, without stolen money." Elias nodded. "The right decision." Charles smiled bitterly. "Right, but late. How much harm I caused my aunt. She is afraid of me. I see it in her eyes." Elias was silent for a moment, then said, "People change. Not always, but sometimes. The main thing is to want to change." "Do you want to?" Charles nodded. "I do." "Then change. Find work, repay debts. Visit your aunt not as an heir, but as a nephew. She will understand and forgive." Charles looked at him for a long time, then asked quietly, "Master, and the fireplace? Does it really howl because of the damper?" Elias looked at him calmly.
"It does. And can it be repaired so the howling stops completely?"
"It can." Charles was silent.
"But you didn't, because the howling protected my aunt from me."
Elias did not answer. Charles smiled. "I didn't understand it immediately, but then I thought, why does the fireplace howl only when I come? And I understood. I throw the door wide open, create a draft, and you didn't repair it fully because while the fireplace howls, I am afraid. And while I am afraid, I don't torment my aunt." Elias shrugged. "Perhaps." Charles sat back on the bench. "You know, Master, at first I was angry, then surprised. Then I thought, a simple stove maker protected my aunt better than the law, better than family, better than the church, with one damper." Elias sat opposite him. "Sometimes the small can do more than the large." Charles nodded. "I want to ask you, when you come to the manor in spring, do not repair the damper completely. Let the fireplace continue to howl. Let it remind me of who I was, so I don't forget and don't return to the old ways." Elias looked at him attentively. This was unexpected. Charles himself was asking to leave the ghost. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. Let my uncle's voice remind me of honor." Elias nodded. "Good.
Charles stood and extended his hand. Elias shook it. Charles's hands were soft, unused to work, but the grip was firm. "Thank you, Master, for everything." Charles left. Elias watched him go. Thomas, who had heard the conversation from the next room, came out. "Master, has he really changed?" Elias shrugged. "We'll see. Words are words. The main thing is deeds. If he finds work, repays debts, and stops tormenting his aunt, then he has changed. If not, the words will remain words." Thomas thought. "Do you believe him?" "I don't know, but I want to believe. A man who admits his mistakes has already taken the first step. Time will show the rest." A week later, Elias went to Hawthorne Manor again, this time at Mrs. Hawthorne's invitation. Frances met him with a smile, a rarity for the old butler. "Mrs. Hawthorne is waiting for you, Master." He led Elias not to the drawing room, but to the winter garden. The room was bright, with large windows and pots of flowers on the sills. In the center stood a table covered with a white tablecloth. On it were a teapot, cups, and pies. Mrs. Hawthorne sat at the table, and beside her was Charles. Elias stopped on the threshold, surprised. Mrs. Hawthorne rose, approached him, and extended her hand. "Master, thank you for coming. Please sit down." Elias sat. Frances poured tea and served apple pie. Elias ate slowly, not understanding why he had been invited. Mrs. Hawthorne spoke first. "Master, I wanted to thank you for what you did for me. You gave me time that allowed Charles to stop and think and change." Elias nodded. "That is good." "He told me he visited you, that you spoke. I am grateful to you, Master, not only for the fireplace, but for doing more." "You gave me time. Time that let Charles pause, reflect, and change." Elias looked at her and suddenly understood. She had known from the very beginning. She had known he had deliberately not repaired the damper fully. She had known and remained silent. She had played the same game. Two people from different worlds, but with one goal: to protect what mattered. Mrs. Hawthorne continued, "I have made a new will. After my death, the manor will go not to Charles, but to a foundation. The foundation will maintain the house as a museum in memory of the general." Charles agreed. He will receive a small share of the money, but not the house. Elias nodded. A wise decision. The house will be preserved. The memory will not disappear. Charles will receive what he deserves. Justice has triumphed. He walked along the spring streets, holding the book under his arm, and thought, life was surprising. Sometimes a small decision, not repairing a damper fully, changed fates. It gave time for change and saved people from trouble. He had not known how it would end when he made the decision, but conscience had prompted the right path, and he had not erred. Thomas waited for him in the workshop. "Well?" Elias smiled. "Everything is good. Mrs. Hawthorne is happy. Charles is changing. The balance is restored." Thomas sighed with relief. Elias sat by the stove and looked into the fire. Spring, a time of renewal, a time of hope. He had done what he had to do, not as a master, but as a man, and that was right. March came into its own. The snow disappeared completely, the earth thawed, buds swelled on the trees, the town transformed from grey and cold to green and alive. People took off heavy coats and put on light jackets. The first greens and early vegetables appeared in the markets. Life flowed along its spring course, faster, brighter, more joyful. Elias had almost no work. Spring and summer were the dead season for stove makers. People forgot about fireplaces and chimneys. It seemed to them that cold would never return. But Elias knew it would. In autumn, they would call for him again to check drafts, clean soot, replace cracked bricks. It had always been so. It would be so again. He used the free time to put his tools in order, stock materials, and teach Thomas the last subtleties of the craft. The boy was now ready to work independently. Another year or two, and he could be released to free bread. Let him open his own business. Elias was not greedy. Apprentices should be taught and released, not kept forever. The craft should spread, passed from hand to hand. At the end of March, Elias received a letter, a rarity for him. Usually orders came by word of mouth, through acquaintances or servants, but this was a real letter in an envelope with a seal. From Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne. He opened it and unfolded the sheet. The handwriting was old-fashioned, neat, with flourishes.
Dear Master, I invite you to visit the manor on the last day of March. I wish to thank you personally for everything you have done for me and my family. With respect, Eleanor Hawthorne. Elias read the letter twice. The invitation was unusual. Gentlemen did not usually thank working men in writing, pay them, and forget. But Mrs. Hawthorne was different. She remembered. On the last day of March, Elias put on a clean shirt, cleaned his boots, took his cap, and set off for the manor. The day was warm and sunny. Along the way, he saw peasants ploughing fields, children playing in the streets, merchants laying out goods. The world had come alive after its winter sleep. The manor met him in spring fashion. Windows were thrown open, curtains fluttered in the breeze. In the garden, the first flowers bloomed, crocuses and daffodils. Francis opened the door and smiled. For the first time, Elias saw a smile on the old butler's face. "Come in, master. You are expected." He led Elias not to the drawing room, but to the winter garden. The room was light. In the center stood the table. Mrs. Hawthorne and Charles sat there. Elias stopped, surprised. Mrs. Hawthorne rose, approached, and extended her hand. "Master, thank you for coming. Please sit down." Mrs. Hawthorne stood, approached him, and extended her hand. "Master, thank you for coming. Please sit down." Elias sat. Francis poured tea and served apple pie. Elias ate slowly, still not fully understanding why he had been invited. Mrs. Hawthorne spoke first. "Master, I wanted to thank you for what you did for me. You gave me time. Time that allowed Charles to change." Charles nodded. "I found honest work as a clerk. The pay is small, but I am repaying my debts slowly but surely. I no longer gamble or live on credit." Elias looked at him. Charles had changed. His face was calmer, his gaze steadier. There was no longer the old restlessness or fear. There was the dignity of a man who had found himself. Mrs. Hawthorne continued, "I have made a new will. After my death, the manor will go to a foundation in memory of my husband. It will become a museum dedicated to the history of our family and the general service to the country." Charles has agreed. He understands that the house is not money, it is memory. Elias nodded. "A wise decision. The house will be preserved, the memory will not die." Charles stood, walked to the window, and looked at the garden. "You know, Master, I thought about the fireplace and why it howled. I realized it was not just physics. It was a lesson I needed to learn. While I was greedy and selfish, the fireplace howled and drove me away. Now that I have changed, the howling has become quieter. I still hear it, but it no longer frightens me. It reminds me." He turned. "Master, I know you did not repair the damper fully on purpose. I know you protected my aunt from me, and I am grateful. You did what I should have done myself. You showed me who I was.
And that was more painful than any rebuke. Elias stood and approached him. People change. Not all, but some. The main thing is to see your mistakes and want to correct them. You saw them. You wanted to. The rest is a matter of time. They stood by the window looking at the garden. Mrs. Hawthorne said quietly, "Master, I want to give you something." She handed him a package wrapped in cloth. Elias unwrapped it. Inside was an old book in a leather binding. On the cover in gold letters, "The Art of Stove Making, Boston, 1787. This book belonged to my grandfather. He was interested in architecture and collected books on building. It is a rarity. I think it will find better use with you than gathering dust on a shelf." Elias took the book, felt its weight, and ran his hand over the cover. The gift was priceless, not because it was expensive, but because it was meaningful. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne." They drank tea, talked about spring and plans. Charles told how he was settling into his new position and learning to live differently. Mrs. Hawthorne shared her thoughts about the museum and what exhibits it would have. Elias listened and occasionally added a word. He felt not like a working man, but like an equal guest. Francis saw him to the exit and paid him generously. At the door, the old butler said, "Master, you did more than you think. You did not just repair a fireplace. You repaired a family." Elias shook his hand and stepped into the street. The sun was setting, painting the sky in golden and pink tones. He walked along the spring road, holding the book under his arm, and thought how surprising life was. Sometimes a small decision changed fates. One damper left unrepaired became a bridge between past and future, protected the weak, taught the strong, and preserved memory. He returned to the workshop in the evening. Thomas had already left. Elias kindled the stove, sat down, and opened the book. The pages had yellowed with time, but the text was clear. Drawings of stoves, diagrams of flues, descriptions of materials. Knowledge accumulated by masters of the past. Knowledge that would now pass to him, then to Thomas, and then to those who came after. The chain would not break. Outside, twilight thickened and the town fell asleep. But in the stove-maker's workshop, the fire burned. He looked into the flames, thinking about the winter he had lived through, the people he had met, and the choices he had made. Everything had been right. Not according to the law, but according to conscience. And conscience was the only judge that never erred. Spring had come. The cold remained behind. Ahead lay summer, then autumn, then winter again, and they would call for him once more to repair stoves and bring warmth into homes. He would work as he always had, honestly, conscientiously, with soul. Because a craft was not just work.
It was a calling. It was service to people.
Elias closed the book, stood, and added wood to the stove. The fire flared brighter, lighting the room with warm light. Warmth. That was what mattered. Warmth of the stove, warmth of the home, warmth of the human soul. While there was warmth, there was life. And while there was life, there was hope. He lay down, covered himself with a blanket, and fell asleep easily and peacefully. He dreamed of stoves, hundreds of stoves he had built in his life. All of them breathed, all of them lived, all of them held warmth, and that was right. But a few weeks later, tragedy struck. One warm spring night, Charles visited his aunt once more, full of good intentions. He entered quietly this time, but a sudden strong gust of wind slammed the front door behind him. The old damper, which Elias had left partially loose as a reminder, vibrated violently under the unexpected draft. Sparks flew. A hidden crack in the ancient flue, weakened by years and the earlier repairs, widened. Within minutes, the chimney caught fire. The historic manor burned fiercely. Mrs. Hawthorne, awakened by the smoke, tried to escape but was overcome by the fumes. She died in the fire that had once protected her. Charles, attempting to save her, was badly burned and survived, but the guilt destroyed him. The house, the memory of the general, was reduced to ashes. The foundation never received it. Charles, broken by grief and his past, fell back into old habits and disappeared into poverty and ruin. Elias stood among the charred ruins weeks later, holding the old book, and realized with heavy heart, sometimes even the kindest intentions, guided by conscience, can lead to unforeseen tragedy. The loose damper that had protected life had, in the end, taken it. The ghost had delivered its final, terrible warning.